right. Hello and welcome, everybody. I hope you are all enjoying AU Online thus far. This is the Engage the Speaker session for Taking Advantage of Freedom, Solzhenitsyn on What to Do with Liberty When You Have It by David Devel. David is a teacher at the University of St. Thomas Department of Catholic Studies, as well as the editor of Logos, Journal of Catholic Thought and Culture. In addition to that, he is also the co-director of the Terence J. Murphy Institute for Catholic Thought, Law, and Public Policy. David, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to begin by just giving a quick recap of my lecture. I know not all of you have probably seen it, but my lecture was on Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was born in 1918. He died in 2008, the age of 89. He was a Nobel Prize-winning writer of various memoir, fiction, what he called his great literary experiments. He was actually raised he was raised to be an Orthodox Christian, but he was in a time in which the lure of Marxism was kind of irresistible to people at that time. Being born just at the cusp of the Russian Revolution, he studied mathematics as well as humanities. He became a much decorated military veteran in World War II, but was sent to the Gulag, to that system of political prisons that operated in the Soviet Union at the time, for a joke he made about Joseph Stalin in a letter. And it was during that time period in the Gulag that he had a great conversion experience. He first discovered what he said was the cornerstone of the universe, justice. Right? He realized that there had to be something objective, and he rediscovered his faith in God. When he came out, he began to teach and also to write. His great breakout work was One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, a novella that was published in Novy Mir, the famous Soviet journal. It was published during a time of sort of greater openness and de-Stalinization, promoted by the then premier Nikita Khrushchev. And then he continued to write other things. He wrote a novel about his experience having cancer while he was during his internment. And then he began to write his great memorial to those people in the Gulag, the 3-volume Gulag Archipelago, which is basically a history. It has novelistic elements, but of course it is what won him great fame. He was eventually exiled. He decided to leave very quickly the Soviet Union. He spent some time in Western Europe and then the US for 20 years. He returned in the 90s when the Soviet Union opened up. And he continued to write and even host a TV show in those later years. What I focus on in my talk then, apart from giving you an introduction to his life, are what I call his great enemies of freedom. And I think that he has 4 enemies. One is happiness. And by that, I mean a very constricted view of happiness that only thinks about happiness outside of the context of what is moral. His second enemy is liberty. Equality itself. Equality, he says in one address, is a natural enemy of liberty. Insofar as you have perfect equality, you can't have liberty. And what he doesn't mean by that political liberty, but he means that equality of outcome. And he understands that liberty is so that people can pursue the good. And when they do that, their natural differences are going to arise. And if you try to make them all perfectly equal, you're going to destroy freedom, but you're also going to destroy what is great in man. His third enemy of freedom is legalism. What he calls doing only that which is within the legal limits. And we all know examples of that, like, well, if it's not illegal, it must be okay. And he's not opposed to a strong legal structure. In fact, he realizes that the sort of the gangsterism of the Soviet era, but also which sadly bled into the Yeltsin era, was something that was very destructive. You need a strong rule of law, but a rule of law must be buttressed by something deeper than that. Otherwise, we're not going to have a really good livable situation. And then the final enemy of liberty that I talk about is his idea that we can focus on rights to the contradiction of any obligations. Like Edmund Burke, he believed that we have natural obligations to family, to society, and those things, which Burke called burdensome duties, right, are part of what makes us human. And if we don't focus on that desire to do the right thing, then our freedom is going to be frittered away and it's going to be destroyed. So I propose then that along with 4 enemies of freedom, there are 4 things to do with freedom when you actually have it. And the first one is to live not by lies, to speak the truth, right? And you can say it in both senses. We at the very least, he says in one great speech to the Soviet leaders, let the lie come into the world, but not by me. But on the other side, we need to speak the truth and say it out loud. But that requires something. And the second thing that you do with freedom is you have to concentrate on finding the truth. There's a lot of fake news, there's a lot of propaganda, there's a lot of distraction in our world, and if you do not concentrate, you will not find it. Something that touches our daily life is the fact that he understood that our world of mass communications was one in which we fritter away that capacity for seeking truth. It's easy to get into the stream and just scroll through things, but that's not the way to concentrate on the truth. The third thing then is to seek God through the conscience, because you have to follow your conscience and you have to do what you know is right. Again, his own conversion away from communist materialism in part came from discovering that cornerstone of the universe, justice. And we have to actually follow that conscience. We're given a conscience for a purpose. Again, that purpose is not just to know vaguely what right and wrong is, but it's actually to seek it out and ultimately to seek out our final end, God. And then the fourth thing to do is once you've done that, then when you know what God wants you to do, you have to become a hero. The whole system of freedom is for the purpose of us doing the truth, living the truth, being in the truth. And if we do that, then we can preserve freedom. But without that, we will see that freedom slips away, even if we're in a free country. Right now, we see this in all sorts of ways in the news every day, that people are silenced. They are told that they have to quash their consciences. Well, Solzhenitsyn is a prophet that we need very much for our day. So that's a kind of recap of my talk. And now I think we'll open it up to questions then.
Yes, we will. And our first one here comes from Philip, who asks and first says, "Thank you for your fine presentation and for your time today. I was particularly interested in the idea of petty liberty. Do you think that perhaps the pettier forms of liberty dominate both the political right and left in our time in the US? And do you think that it threatens to undermine genuine liberty, being a bad knockoff, so to speak? How might we cultivate a vision of truer liberty?"
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, we do focus on small things. And I mean, I don't want to downplay the petty liberties. I think, there's a certain sense in which if you don't get the small things right, the big things will likely not follow. But we can be focused so much on petty liberties that we don't actually see the end. And that's why in my talk, I focused on Solzhenitsyn's emphasis on what liberty is for, right? What's its goal? Well, its goal is to enable a society to have people become heroic and to act for the good of others, to do the right. Ultimately, I think theologically, although he was not a theologian, but it's clear there, it's also to know God and to know our true end. So how do we get a society to focus on the big picture? Well, I think we do have to defend, petty liberties to an extent, just as we have to defend consumer markets and things like that. But we have to constantly be giving a vision of a moral universe and a moral society and moral market. I think this has come up a number of times in Acton circles over the years. We've said, we often want to defend the liberty of markets, but when we defend them, we often defend them in ways that are very narrow. And we touch on, how the results are going to be better if we have this sort of society. And that's certainly true. A society that has deep market liberty is going to provide good results in many ways. But really, if we're going to take that good and keep it, we need to defend the markets, to defend civil society, to defend democratic aspects of life in such a way that we show that they are there for that deep good, and that they are not merely for, for my own benefit or so that I seem free, but they're there for the bigger common good. As I said in my lecture, Solzhenitsyn, it notes that if you get into the materialist game and say, well, we can produce better stuff, the problem is that those people who are pushing a different vision, they may not be able to actually pay off what they're given, but they are able to promise more. And people hear the promises and they say, oh, well, you're promising, this sort of stuff, but they're promising me a Green New Deal. And although they can't fulfill that, people look for a vision. As the prophet Isaiah says, without a vision, the people perish. And so in order to build up that society of genuine liberty and freedom, we need to provide a vision and provide that sort of heroic element to it, that people who are living in a genuinely free society with free markets and a rule of law actually provide a vision of the good. And so I think that's what we need to do. Defend it all, but defend it in the big picture.
All right, thank you. Our next question is an anonymous one who asks, how can Christian college professors stand for the truth while exercising prudence in confronting the enemies of freedom in higher education, even Christian higher education today?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it is very difficult. The times are such that we need to be able to speak, and this is something that I think we wrestle with a great deal these days, is that when are we acting in the name of prudence, and when are we acting in the name of a false prudence that really is a cowardice and just it's acting out of a desire not to ruffle feathers or not to endanger our own situation. And I don't think from the Christian standpoint, either in Solzhenitsyn's Orthodox tradition or my Catholic tradition or any of the Protestant traditions, we are required to seek out martyrdom. But I do think that we do need to figure out ways in which we can cultivate the ability to speak the truth in ways that are going to be criticized, surely, but ways that are going to be heard. And I think perhaps one of the biggest things is you need to work on, and I need to work on this, cultivating relationships with others with whom we disagree, and being able to try to have conversations in a humane fashion. And the newest issue of Religion and Liberty, I just saw yesterday, Brad Birzer, a frequent contributor to Acton University, had a piece in Religion and Liberty about the fact that what we really need to get rid of cancel culture is we need to have those humane connections with people. And I think even within a university, I think we need to be able to figure out what people are open to the truth, even in a Christian university or a Christian college. Certainly, we need to find those people, and we need to build up connections with people who agree with us, with people who are open to what we're doing, and to those who disagree, but who are open to having those conversations. You might call them, the honest liberals, the ones who still want this, but are afraid to act. But you need to build up those relationships. I say that to myself as well. Build up those relationships, build up those private conversations, and then start to work toward opening things up. But I do think that there is a time to be bold at times, and we need to pray. This is Acton University, so there's no limits on saying we can't pray, but we need to pray for the Holy Spirit's guidance about when to speak out and when to be bold and how to do that. And because sometimes I think, we do need to speak out boldly, even in our place of work, or at least, at the very least, speak out in the places that we can. But you've raised a big question. As a society closes down, what do you do? And I think Solzhenitsyn wants us to be bold. He has a great section in the Gulag Archipelago where he talks about at the beginning of the raids, on people, taking these political prisoners. He says, what if somebody just actually called out and said, no, this isn't going to work, and other people joined in? Would the thugs of the Soviet Union have dragged these people in if people had even just spoken out? And I think that that's something that we need to do in our own way. Again, prudence, not false prudence. And we need to make that be a prudence that's guided by God. But I think we need to open up conversations, and we need to be sly. Thank you for that question.
All right, and in a similar vein, or potentially a little bit of a follow-up to that from Trevor, what do you think that Solzhenitsyn would do in regards to the new cultural revolution sweeping the country today, where cancel culture and erasing our country's history have taken hold?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the big things that we need to do. We have to be, again, prudent in the right way. If we're talking about taking down Confederate statues in southern towns, some of which were erected long after the Civil War and were erected by the KKK, I think we need to be able to say, yeah, that's perhaps not something that's for our square. But I think we do need to defend the idea that no, taking down a statue of Abraham Lincoln, as I've seen, recent protesters have done, or taking down statues of prominent abolitionists, this is something that we need to not do. We need to not allow our culture to be denuded of all of our history, because that is really the end. We already have a problem, and I think it's connected with that point that I brought up of Solzhenitsyn about the need to concentrate on the truth, of building up people who know that history and are able to communicate it, who are able to seek out the truth. We need to be able to speak out and defend what's good in our country. I think in the case of the claims about systemic racism in the United States, I think that many of the ways in which people talk about this are very dubious. And I think that we need to be able to say, no, we have racism in our history. We have racism now. But the idea that everything about our system is racist is just not true. Let's focus on the real problems. But to do that, we're going to need to be able to educate. And I think, education of young children is one of the key points that needs to be done in our near future, because the generation growing up in public schools, but also even many private schools, is one that has been taught a sort of narrative about the unique evils of the United States, about Western civilization, about Christianity, and that they're believing lies, right? They hear those words of revolution. Gary Saul Morson, the great Russian literature professor at Northwestern University, has a recent piece in the New Criterion about Alexander Herzen, who was a Russian who lived outside of Russia and who saw through some of the lies about scientific socialism. But the siren song of materialism, Professor Morson says, was one that he could not resist. If you said revolution and a bright new future, people flock to that. Well, I think if we know the history of revolutions and how they end up in blood, how the heaven on earth project ends up most likely with a hell on earth, I think we're going to be able to dissuade people. But that's going to require, I think, education first and foremost, but also, again, speaking out in the public square about what's good about our heritage, Christian heritage, Jewish heritage, Western heritage, the American heritage. No false narratives, no pie in the sky about how everything has always been grand and always is, but reality about what are the goods that we're defending when we defend a free and virtuous society. Thanks for that.
All right, we have another anonymous question here who asks, how can Christian students stand against the materialistic indoctrination thrown at them at most colleges?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think they need to be prepared to know, again, I think it's a matter of education, but I think you need to educate yourselves on the history of how it is that progress, so-called, was made over the last 2,000 years. And I think there are some some narratives about the rise of science that need to be contradicted, because you get a very typical narrative that science only arose when we put down the evils of medieval belief or Christian belief or something like that. And there are some very good books about our heritage. The Orthodox theologian David Bentley Hart, I don't like all of his work on every subject, but he has a book called Atheist Delusions that's very good on giving a history of how it is that it's actually Jewish and Christian ideas that built up this progress. It's not materialist ideas, but indeed very spiritual ones that built our society. There are also very good books by other scholars. The Baylor sociologist Rodney, well, I've lost his name just now. But he has a history of Western civilization. It'll come to me as soon as this webinar is over, I'm sure. But James Hannam has done a history of the rise of science that's very good. So you need to know how it is that actually it's not materialism that has built what's good about us, but it's a particular spiritual vision. And you take that spiritual vision away, and people are not going to get what they think today. We all think that it's, well, if we get rid of God, then we have the iPhone 11 and rocket ships. But that's not actually true. And the rise of science, the rise of many of our freedoms were predicated deeply upon Christian roots, Christian and classical roots. So I think, again, students need to know history. You need to know very concrete facts. You need to be able to answer those who basically are telling kind of narratives about how we got to where we are. I'm afraid that what we're seeing now is that in the absence of that history, when people don't know where they've been, other people are going to tell them where they're going to go, and it's not going to be pleasant. So know your history. Look into these great texts that teach us about how we got to where we are. I think that's the best thing.
All right, our next question comes from John, who asks, what's your piece of advice when talking to those that try to claim that classical liberalism or libertarianism shouldn't have anything to do with a moral compass and just be an attitude of tolerating everything and hoping that others tolerate us? However, in the practice, we see that religious freedom and traditional morality are always being persecuted as not modern or false. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And that's why, Solzhenitsyn, in my talk, I talked a little bit about how he sometimes seems like he has a kind of anti-market mentality. And I tried to explain that that he may not be an economist, but he's reacting against that sort of materialist vision that sometimes libertarians and classical liberals will give off. And I think that the best way to approach this is to say that there are conservative roots of liberal practice and even liberal theory. I think one of the best writers on this today is Daniel Mahoney at Assumption College. I reviewed for Religion and Liberty a number of years ago one of his books, The Conservative Foundations of Liberal Thought. And his point is that in order to protect what we think of as a liberal order with that rule of law and with that tolerance and with that openness, you have to acknowledge those philosophical and theological roots. And there have been a number of books about this, not always by religious believers. There's a book this last year by Tom Holland, a skeptical, I don't know whether he calls himself an agnostic or atheist, British historian called Dominion, in which he's arguing that much of what we have in the modern world is predicated upon, a very concrete, if you want to say metaphysical vision. It's not, it's not that it creates a view of everything, but it has a foundation there. Larry Seidentop of Cambridge also has a book about, how Christianity developed the liberal world. I think these are texts that have a lot of good information in them. Classical liberals and libertarians who believe that we can just sort of dump history and just have everybody free, I think are deluding themselves. If you're going to adhere to a robust notion of a liberal society, a liberal order, liberal framework, with a kind of free market, even a libertarian market, if you don't mind those terms. What you need is you need that foundation in which that order can grow. And Solzhenitsyn, again, is very clear. He's not saying that we have to have a sort of theocracy. Many people interpreted him as, maybe we needed a kind of a Russian theocracy or something like that. That's not what he's saying. But what he is saying is that in order to maintain those freedoms, you have to have that at the very least recognition that there is truth in the world. There is justice, right? That justice has a concrete reality. And it's not just simply what we might call commutative justice, rules about exchange, but there's something deeper than that. So I think we need to emphasize to classical liberals and libertarians who want to throw this out, no, we cannot get those fruits without, while we cut off the rest of the plant. And that doesn't mean, again, that, everybody has to agree exactly on the Trinity and things like that. But what it does mean is that you have to have that concrete anthropology in which man is made in the image of God and has a tendency toward truth and has a desire for truth and has a capability to embrace the truth and create a society in that way. So I think that's the way we need to focus. Again, don't cut the roots off of the flowers if we want to keep them. Thanks.
All right, our next question comes from Bob from Canada. He specifies that in. He says, there are cultural factors about niceness and apologizing that make us very sensitive to tone. I'm comfortable ethically with being critical of ideas rather than people, but I do find some great statements from other cultures overpowering in the terms of their acridity. That's not complaining about needing to say true things that are offensive because they're true, but the practical problem that just means something is shut down and not heard due to its tone. How did Solzhenitsyn manage to cross those cultural complications around tone? And when it came to speaking truth, did he run into difficulties in that way at all?
Yes, I want to note something. I just glanced up at the chat. Several people have given me Rodney Stark. So thank you for not waiting until after the webinar when I would have shouted Rodney Stark. But let me answer the question then. Yeah, I think Solzhenitsyn did have problems, and with being received because of his tone, but also much of it was perceived to be not just tone issues, but real concrete complications of people disagreeing. And Solzhenitsyn did, kind of take up the mantle of a prophet in certain ways, and he asserted things. He did not back down, and he said them often very bluntly. When he would address Western audiences, he would say, look, I'm a friendly critic, but I'm a critic nonetheless. And a friend is not somebody who simply is a yes man and says, oh, well, you're doing everything fine. Should we emulate Solzhenitsyn's tone? I think, again, this is a matter of prudence. I think sometimes the situations call for us to be very blunt speaking about things. But the trick is, how do you speak bluntly, but also speak charitably? And I think, there are the sort of the life hacks of saying positive things first. And there are all sorts of ways of phrasing things. Ultimately, I think there is no guarantee that what we're going to say is going to be received in the right spirit, because if people are ready for cancel culture, they're looking for whatever they can grasp onto. So I think we have to be ready to both speak the truth in love and think about our tone, but we also have to be ready for the situation in which, no matter how we say some things, they're going to be rejected just because people have set themselves up to want to have a demon and to have a view, an ideological view that doesn't allow for other things. But I think one thing that helps, and perhaps I should have said this earlier, is I think, and the reason why I focused on talking to people in person is because if you are perceived as somebody who's actually listening to somebody, if you're perceived as listening, other people are more likely to hear. And I think when you have those personal conversations first, it's going to change the way in which things are received. The old medieval tag is that, everybody receives things according to the mode of the receiver. In other words, how people take things in is going to go according to the way in which they take them. But if you can disarm people and show that you love them, or at least show that you respect them, right, and have those conversations, they too will listen, all right, as you will, but they're also going to be willing to defend you. And I've seen this even in the academy where people have been accused of saying things that were offensive, even if they weren't, but because of their tone, but because of relationships with others who differed with them, those other people stepped in and said, no, this isn't true. Maybe he should have said it in a different way, but this is not a guy who's filled with hate. So again, there's no guarantee that you're going to be listened to or accepted, but I do think that there are ways in which we can encourage other people to listen well. So thank you for that.
All right, we're coming up on time here, so this will be our last question, and it is from another anonymous attendee who says, I'm a student at a small Catholic liberal arts college, and there are great things about this school that are worth preserving. How can students practically oppose ideology from penetrating itself into our administration and the student body? Is that even a goal worth pursuing?
Yeah, I mean, well, okay, this is what I would tell you. If you see that, particularly at the administrative level, things coming in, have your parents complain, because the people who are paying the bills are often listened to, but students too are often listened to. So I would feel free to to actually make your views known. And again, I think that the best way to start out is to talk to others who have concerns, and then I would approach your administration. I had a student a few years ago who was upset about some decisions made by the administration. She made the decision to go to to one of the very high-level administrators' office hours, made an appointment and said, hey, I want to talk about these things. Now, it didn't fix everything that she wanted to, but I think it put on the radar of those administrators the fact that not students do care about these things. For a practical point, right? Seek ye first the kingdom of God, and all these things will be added to you. I've never forgot that student doing that. So whenever she's asked me a couple of times to write recommendations for her, and that sort of thing is impressive. And I think it's something that is remembered, not just by people who are writing a rec letter for you, but it's remembered by others whom you do contact. Look, you took that opportunity to come and speak to me. So I would say, yeah, I think you should express your concerns about this. But then the other side of it is, you can curse the darkness all you want, and you can try to fight ideology. But ultimately, if you don't have something positive to take its place, you're going to lose. Again, that's why I say Solzhenitsyn says we've got to get the story right. If you go the materialist route, well, this will make us all much richer than everybody else. That's impressive at a certain level. But the materialist who promises you the moon or the Green New Deal is going to win because they're giving you a comprehensive vision of the good. So I think the big thing is you need to be able to figure out ways in which you can promote a vision of the good about these particular ideological issues that are so difficult. Promote that and say, you're right, we have problems. And here are the answers to this. This is the vision that we have to have. Again, to go back to the prophet, without a vision, the people perish. So that, I think you're on the right track. Definitely complain, curse the darkness, but also light those candles.
Great. Even though we have some unanswered questions here, this is the end of our time. So first, I would like to thank you, David, first for your talk and also for your answers here, and for everybody who has attended this session. On behalf of the Acton Institute, thank you very much, and I hope you all enjoy the rest of Acton University online. David, because there are some unanswered questions, are there ways that attendees can continue to get in contact with you to continue this dialogue?
Yeah, I mean, send me an email, dpdeval@stthomas.edu. I will write back to you, send me questions. You can contact me through that. I'm on LinkedIn, I'm on Facebook. I'm not on Twitter because that can be a rough place, but you can contact me in these other ways. And I'd love to contact you and answer further questions. These have been great questions. And although it's a weird session, on Zoom. I think this has just been fantastic. So thank you for your wonderful questions and the help with Rodney Stark. That name will now be emblazoned.
Great. Well, thank you all, everybody.